the Palestinian.
Oh, now we're changing it among the Israeli 900 versus we said whether there were more Israeli or Palestinian civilians killed in the last 3 years.
Here's my point. Let me make it again. 900 Israelis killed,
a lawyer's trick.
2,500 Palestinians killed.
Yeah.
If you just look at the number of civilians, the number of Israelis among the 900 is greater than the number of civilians among the 2,500. That's what I say in my book. That's what I said from the beginning. If you can't answer something, you immediately say it's a lawyer's trick.
A simple question.
It is a fact.
Are you saying that according to the B'Tselem website, more Palestinian civilians, more Israeli civilians have been killed than Palestinian civilians?
Absolutely. And if you
don't start the discounting game.
No. Let me tell you what
this is not a bar. This is not a bazaar.
Of course,
I'm asking you.
It's an attempt to get at the truth.
Keep it down.
And here's the truth. Here's the truth. If you take the Palestinian figure, now we have to have the same definitions, and you eliminate from the Palestinian figure.
I ask you the B'Tselem website because it can be easily checked by anyone listening.
Check it out, and you'll see that there is nothing on the B'Tselem website that will disagree that if you take the 2,500 and you eliminate the suicide bombers, you eliminate the people who have been 6 suicide bombers. Wait a minute. Let's focus on this. 6 suicide bombers. Okay. We're talking about how many suicide bombers have produced the 900 deaths. You say it's 6.
I'm not saying 6.
No, you did say 6.
Mr. Dershowitz, we won't play that game.
It's not a
game. We won't play the game.
You say 6.
Let's look at the website. You said, according to the B'Tselem website, there are more Israeli civilians killed in the last 3 years than Palestinians killed.
B'Tselem, Human Rights Watch, nobody will dispute that figure. I have never heard anybody dispute that figure before.
Can you repeat the question?
The question is whether the number of civilians, innocent civilians who have no in any way contact with terrorism, people who are like the mother, the daughter and her father, who were on a walk in Emek Rephaim, and on the night before her wedding, and who were blown up by Palestinian terrorists. If you compare the number of people like that on the Israeli side and on the Palestinian side, women and children and complete non-combatants, you will find that the number of Israeli casualties among civilians exceeds the number of Palestinian casualties among innocent civilians who are non-combatants and not involved in any way in terrorism and were killed by the Israelis, as distinguished from killed by Palestinian terrorists as collaborators. That is simply a fact. I know of no source that disputes that. I haven't heard Mr. Finkelstein dispute it. All he wants to do is focus on my sources without focusing on the truth and the conclusion of my arguments.
There's a very simple way for anyone to check this. B'Tselem has a breakdown of casualties on both sides, civilian and military.
Right.
Just go to the website.
Absolutely. I agree with that. And just see what their definition is.
Next point.
Right.
I didn't ask for their definition.
You have to make a definition of what is a combatant.
Right, they have a definition. And then they have the numbers.
And if you look at my book,
they have the numbers.
Look at my book, I make a very strong argument that there has to be a continua of civilianality.
Okay,
this is a concept that I introduced in my book, Why Terrorism Works, and it's a very important point, and that is the Geneva Accords define civilians in a certain way, and I think the world is now recognizing that the concept of civilianality is a continuum and is a matter of degree, and there's a big difference between the civilian just walking down the street, or the child, or the person coming from the Wailing Wall and being blown up in a bus, and people who harbor terrorists, people who support terrorists, people who encourage terrorists. Let me give you an example, and I give it in my book. There was a terrible rape that occurred in Massachusetts a few years ago, where some people raped a woman, some people held her down, some people cheered, some people blocked access, and some people simply refused to make the phone call that could have saved her lives. I think we all agree that every one of those people are morally accountable for the rape to a different degree. There are the rapists and there are the accessories. I make the same argument about terrorism. There are the people who wear the bomb. They're clearly the terrorists. There are the people who send them. They're clearly terrorists. There are the people like Mrs. Arafat who state that if she had a son rather than a daughter, she would train that son to be a suicide bomber. There are people who cheer and put up the posters. There are people who provide funds, like Saudi Arabia, to Hamas terrorists. We have a continuum of civilianality, and it's very important that as we look at the distinction between combatants and non-combatants, that we take that into account. I try very hard to make refined, sophisticated, nuanced arguments in my books about that. I don't need sources for that. That's my idea. That's my contribution to the debate. We haven't heard any response to that. All we've heard is little piddling claims that there's a site for a statistic that nobody disputes, namely the number of people killed in Black September. And I cite a book called The One Day in September, which was also made into, by the way, if I'm not mistaken, an Oscar-winning film. And so, yes, I do cite all those statistics. Yes, I do cite statistics for that show that the number of people who were killed, for example, here, you look at the B'Tselem site. They say 396 were minors under the age of 18. Now, think about that statistic for a second.
Palestinians.
We now know that Palestinians...
We just pulled up the B'Tselem website on their casualties.
We now know that Palestinians are using younger and younger suicide bombers all the time. They are using kids as young as 13 and 14. They are using women. They are using pregnant women. It should come as no surprise that the number of people below the age of 18, say between 15 and 18, have increased dramatically. That doesn't tell us anything about whether they're combatants. I would ask Mr. Finkelstein, does the Israeli army have the right to shoot and kill a 15-year-old child who was wearing a suicide belt and a bomb belt and about to enter into a populated area? The answer is, of course they do. And B'Tselem would list that as somebody killed under the age of 18.
Okay.
So we're talking about something very different than talking about combatants and non-combatants. The number of combatants is what I'm talking about, not the number of combatants, whether they're 15 years old or 16 years old or 14 years old. It doesn't matter how old a child is when an adult has put a suicide belt around him. It's a tragedy. But the person responsible for the death of that 15-year-old is the person who gave him the suicide belt and not the person who shot him. Self-defense applies just as much to a 15-year-old as it does to an 18 or 19-year-old. And that's the point of the case for Israel. And I really urge people, now you've heard Finkelstein say he's read the book. Now you read the book. Read the book, read the footnotes, write to me. My email address is available. You tell me whether you agree with Finkelstein or whether you agree with me. Read the book, the whole book. Read the arguments and read the quotes that he says come from other sources. See if the quotes are inaccurate. Check them against the original. Look at the chapter on Jenin. See if you disagree. Read my analysis of how many people are killed. Read my analysis of Supreme Court decisions and tell me if you think I'm wrong, that if only the United States had a Chief Justice like Aaron Barak instead of William Rehnquist, that instead of the United States refusing to intrude in what's going on in Guantanamo today, if the United States took as its model the Israeli Supreme Court and looked hard at what was going on, whether or not you don't agree with me and think that the United States would be in a better situation. Look at the data about the number of people who were killed, whether they come from the Human Rights Watch, whether they come from Ma'ariv. Ask yourself whether Ma'ariv, that's very critical of Israel, Yediot Ahronot, very critical of Israel, or Haaretz is very critical of Israel, has ever disputed the figures about the numbers of combatants versus non-combatants killed. And then ask the crucial question, the one crucial question, is there not a difference between targeting civilians, that is, picking them out and killing them because they're civilians, and going after combatants and in the process accidentally killing civilians? That is the key moral difference that makes the difference between a civilized society
Let me ask you a
question.
When a missile slams into a crowded civilian area and they say they are aiming for a Hamas leader and a number of Palestinians die, do you consider that the unintended consequences of that missile targeting the Hamas leader, or do you consider that a logical extension of aiming a missile at a crowded civilian area?
It's a very good question. I have a whole chapter, a whole section of my book on that. And I argue, in fact, my criticism of targeted assassinations is not that it's wrong as a matter of principle. If when Bill Clinton targeted Osama bin Laden for assassination, if he had only gotten him before 9/11, I think the world would have given him a Nobel Peace Prize. If, in fact, we could have gotten Saddam Hussein on the eve of the Gulf War and avoided this catastrophic war that we've gotten into, targeted assassination would be a good thing. Remember, when we went after Saddam Hussein, we killed innocent people in the process. When we went after his sons, we killed innocent people in the process. When we went after the place he was supposed to be having lunch. My criticism of Israel is all too often they target people when they know there are going to be civilians around. And I disagree with that. That's wrong. But let's look at the last time they went after Hamas leaders.